I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
All right, everyone on Facebook land. So, hope everyone is doing well. Today is a special Civil Conversations. I am pretty excited about it. I'm going to give a couple people some more time to get on. But what has me excited about this is that we are able to glean some experiences from 2 amazing people, Mrs. Roots and Steve Weiss. Part of the reason why I wanted to do this type of civil conversations is because when it comes to the things that are going on in modern day, when it comes to social justice, racial differences, equality, biases, etc., I think we unintentionally dismiss history. And try to solve it with like, why aren't we just doing something about it right now? But I think it's important to note that there are people who are alive today who experienced some of the pains and struggles of yesterday, and definitely experienced a lot of the victories as well. And that's something I'm sure we're going to cover tonight. This one's going to be just a tad bit different and maybe a little bit longer. There's, like I said, there's 154 years of experience. I think I mentioned that in my earlier post between these two, and we want to give time for that wisdom to come out in this conversation. So for those who are joining online, please feel free to make civil comments and state what you would like to, type what you'd like to ask, any questions, or just join in. I'm sure the stories tonight are going to be quite amazing. So I'm checking over here now. I'm doing the iPad thing now, guys, so I don't look down at my phone and read comments, so that makes it a lot easier just to see how we are with viewership. So it looks like viewership's going up. And so I want to take a minute out first to start with introductions. So Mrs. Roots, do you mind giving us a small introduction of who you are, please?
Well, I am, 2 days ago, I was 86 years old. I was born in a small town in West Virginia called Wautoga. I lived there until I was 8 years old. When I was 8 years old, my dad moved the family to Virginia, here in Richmond, where I have been for the remainder of my life. I went to elementary school, high school, nursing school, all right in the city of Richmond. So I'm the mother of 5 kids, 8 grandchildren, and 10 great-grandchildren.
Wow.
So I've had a busy life and a whole lot of busy kids and grandkids.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. And Steve Weiss.
Steve Weiss, that is my name. And before I talk about myself, I want to just, Matt, I told you this over the phone, I want to thank you so much for what you're doing. And I mean, this is an absolutely brilliant idea that you've had. And as I told you, I think you need to pitch it to some local radio and TV stations. I really do. I'm serious. I mean, these, and I especially want to thank Jessica, Ashley, and Michaela, and Tim, Tony, Josiah, and Jason for their open, frank, and fresh perspectives, for sharing all of that information. I thought it was fascinating. And for Jason, by the way, I did see that he had a Boston Red Sox shirt behind him, so I wore my Yankee shirt just to rub it in a bit. But
I'm sure Jason's going to love that.
yeah. But as Matt said, I grew up in the North. I grew up in the Bronx in New York City, And I grew up in, my family was lower middle income, I guess, and I grew up in the projects in the Bronx. And the entire neighborhood was extremely diverse. I had friends of every nationality, color, religion, you name it.
Right.
And hopefully, as we go through these discussions, I'll tell you a little bit more about my background. I'm now married to Mrs. Roots. I'm married to an oncology nurse, and we have twins, a boy and a girl. And my wife and I have the same birthday, not the same birth year, but the same birthday. So we have 4 people in our family, but we only buy 2 cakes. Isn't that typical of a Jewish family?
So, Steve, that's priceless. So, I want to level set a little bit from a historical standpoint. I'm only going to take 2 minutes, maybe less than that for that. And then I would just love to get you guys' perspectives overall personally. So, for those who joined, part of the reason why this is important, I mentioned the title of this is, I was born before Jim Crow. Steve was born about 13 years prior to the end. I was born before the end of Jim Crow. Steve was born about 13 years before the end of Jim Crow, and Mrs. Roots was 31 at the end of Jim Crow, and so, at the end of the year that Jim Crow ended. And I think it's critical for us to be able to get those perspectives. One, Mrs. Roots was an adult, and she was able to live out a significant part of the civil rights movement prior to the end of Jim Crow, and of course post that. And Steve being a teenager, right, in the Northeast. And in the North, the perspective on race is a bit different. It may not have been as overt, but it was there, right? And the biases were there. So I'm going to spend about 30 seconds reading about what Jim Crow is, and then I would love to get Mrs. Roots to start off first with just some of her perspective on her life and what it's like. What does she think about the way things are today, and how have we progressed as well? So real quick, so Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. Named after a Black minstrel show character, the laws, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968, were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and death. That's pretty critical. And guys, just time-wise, this was only 55 years ago, okay? Just mind-boggling to even think about that. The roots of Jim Crow laws began as early as 1865, immediately after following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. So we can go into more detail about that and what Jim Crow was probably later on in the conversation. But Mrs. Roots, my first question for you is, what was life like for you in the South, right? Like you told everybody coming from, West Virginia and then moving to Virginia at the time you did, and it was actually before World War II. So I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, it was really an eye-opener for me because, like I said, I left West Virginia when I was 8 years old. And the mere fact that it was such a small town, everybody lived not close together like you do in the city, but the houses were all within walking distance. And of course, the town was so small. Everybody knew everybody in the town, white and Black. And we lived together as brothers and sisters, playing together. And we only had a one-room schoolhouse where I started school. And everybody was taught in that one room, whatever grade you were in, that one teacher taught every grade in that school. And then when my dad moved us from West Virginia to Richmond, I got a rude awakening because things were so much different. Like I said, I had never heard the difference between Black and white. You did this and you didn't do that. And so we had the street that I lived on, we had streetcars running up and down that street. And so by us being from this little country town, we were just anxious to get on the streetcar and have a ride. And so we jumped on the streetcar and sat right on the front seat. And as the streetcar rolled by the house, all the kids were in an uproar. They were just jumping and shouting and hollering, "Get up, get up, get up." And when we got back from our ride on the streetcar, our question was, "What were you all so excited about?" And they said, "Don't you know you weren't supposed to sit on the front seat?" Wow, the seat was empty.
Wow.
You don't sit on the front seat here. You're supposed to sit on the back seat of the streetcar. So that was my first eye opener as far as Jim Crow or whoever, whatever the era was then. And of course, we didn't, when I went to school, the schools were all segregated. So it was like the neighborhood schools, and everybody who lived in that neighborhood went to that particular school. And even when I was out of elementary school and into high school, schools were still segregated. We rode past the white schools and went a mile or two further to go to the school that was designated as school for blacks. And so by 1950, I was already out of school. And I didn't have to deal with the schools being segregated, but I can tell you what happened when I was in school. We never got any new books in the city of Richmond. All of our books came from the schools that the white kids had used, because they still had the name of the schools in them. So the books that we had for our curriculum were passed down from the white schools to us to use. So we always had secondhand books, and it was just like, everything was hand-me-down in the field of education.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry, Ms. Bruce. Can I ask a question about that real quick?
Mm-hmm.
And sorry to cut you off. If the books were handed down, are you aware of? And again, if you don't know, then that's okay. How far behind may have been the editions of the books from what the information that you had, right? You understand what I'm saying? Like, if you got a hand-me-down, how do you know that the information is current?
Well, I don't guess we knew. We were just taught from the books that were given to the teachers to teach from.
Wow.
So what I'm surmising is that if this was a sixth grade class, and we got the books from John Marshall, that's one of the high schools. Thomas Jefferson was the other high school. And if we got the books from those schools, they had probably been used for 4 or 5 years to teach that sixth grade class at that particular school. And then by the time they would begin to wear out, they were just passed on down to us for our sixth grade class. That's what I'm surmising.
Wow. Okay. Now, I appreciate you answering that question. That just came to mind while you were telling your story. I apologize for cutting you off, but that was
if you
wow.
think about it, the only thing that would really be behind would be, in fact, the history books, because the math, the English, grammar, that's not necessarily dated, or at least I don't believe they're dated in terms of being refreshed dramatically. So the history itself, the history content may be a little bit behind.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm sorry, Ms. Roots. Do you mind continuing from there with the education onto adulthood?
Well, I started to say it's ironic that in high school,
mm-hmm.
the superintendent, whenever he was going to visit a school, of course, they always the school was notified that the superintendent was coming to visit, and it was like we were children, but we didn't need to be treated like kindergartners. So we were kind of like all the classes were notified that the superintendent was coming to visit the school. So it was expected that you should be on your best behavior, because he was coming and he was going to be watching you, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about it now, it's really, it's hurting, and then it's kind of funny in a sense. Like you've already been taught by your parents how you're supposed to act, no matter whether school or any place else. But just because the superintendent was coming, and you knew he was white, that he was going expecting the best out of you. And these are some of the things that just stick in your craw even after all of these years.
Wow. So you still remember it, you still feel it.
I do.
Wow. 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 So actually, you know what? Maybe this is a good pause point, and then we can continue back. Steve, if you don't mind giving us a little bit of your history,
Sure.
and then we can come back around.
Sure. As I mentioned before, I grew up in a lower middle income projects in the Bronx. And because it was lower income, we had people from all nationalities, all religions, black, white, Puerto Rican, Chinese, Indian, all religions, and I happen to be Jewish. But when I made friends because they were people that I became friendly with and within the neighborhood. Same thing in school. The schools were already integrated because they never had the segregation up there. So even in school, my best friend in school was Philip Harris, who happened to be a black young man. My best friend from kindergarten through sixth grade. In the projects, my best friend was Manuel Feliciano and Alan Hicks. Manuel was Puerto Rican. Alan Hicks happened to be black. But we had a crowd of, 15, 20 kids every day after school. When weather permit, we go down to the parking lot and we play stickball or punch ball or slap ball. And, it was one happy family. From birth until I think I was about 14, I lived in that neighborhood. I had a friend because he became a friend, not because of what he looked like or what his family background was or what his beliefs were. My family, as I said, was a conservative Jewish family, which meant the following: that we had 2 sets of dishes and 2 sets of silverware. One set of dishes and silverware were for meat products. So if my mom was making lamb chops or steak or hamburgers or spaghetti and meatballs, we used the meat plates and the meat silverware. And if she was making eggs or something that was of a dairy nature or fish, we used the dairy plates and the dairy silverware. But you don't mix the two. You couldn't use the dairy for the meat and you couldn't use the meat for the dairy. And I didn't understand that, but my parents sent me to Hebrew school, just like in public school, the kids would get out on Tuesdays early to go to what they called religious instruction, which they would go to church and have religious classes. So my parents sent me to Hebrew school because we were Jewish. And I said, well, I guess that's what we're supposed to do. And in the Jewish religion, when a boy turns 13, he has a special ceremony. It's called a bar mitzvah. And so there's a religious ceremony in the synagogue, and you actually lead the service because my family was conservative. I actually had to lead the service in front of the entire congregation in the Hebrew language, by the way. Not a word of English was spoken. So the 7 years that I went to Hebrew school in preparation for my bar mitzvah prepared me for that. And then after that Saturday ceremony, when you turn 13, then typically the families have the equivalent of what a wedding ceremony and a big reception, and you have friends and family and a band, and you get all these nice gifts as a 13-year-old, which I'm not sure that my parents turned them all over, but story for another day. But when my parents said, okay, we're going to have, you can have X number of people, and Steve, you're entitled to, because the bar mitzvah boy had a dais, just like a wedding party has a dais with the bridegrooms and the maids of honor. So I was allowed to have a dais, and they said, who would you like up on the dais? That was easy. I wanted Manuel Feliciano, I wanted Alan Hicks, and I wanted Philip Harris. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I mentioned those 3 names, I saw some hesitation in my mother and father's faces, and they said, we'll have to talk it over. And I said, well, you told me I'm entitled to 10, 5 on each side. I've given you 3 names, and we could have cousins and relatives on to fill up the rest. And they said, well, Manuel is Puerto Rican, and Philip and Alan are black. I have to talk to your dad about that. So after long discussion, and trust me, I could not figure it out. I could not, because I was only 13. So, it's not like I read the newspaper or watch the news every day and understand what this is all about. These were my friends. To me, it was my family. It was my friends were my family. Finally, you were going to say something?
I have one, but go ahead with the thought, because
so finally they did acquiesce, and I was allowed to bring my friends into onto the dais, and we had a great time. They took video. Well, in those days it was 16 mil or 8 millimeter, I think. And
you didn't have the iPhone. You didn't have the iPhone 10 back there. Or anything?
I'm an Android guy. Yeah. So they took film, and they took. We had a professional photographer. And we make a nice album, like you make a wedding album. And I was very proud of that. But I couldn't understand why my parents were a bit hesitant to have them there. And I know now. I mean, I figured it out years later. Is they were afraid of what the rest of the real family was going to think.
Mm.
And I could care less what the rest of the real family could think.
So do you, out of curiosity, and just to kind of it's wild to even hear what you just said, especially going back to, you grew up not conscious of all of the racial differences or any form of racism or biases, but then the moment you made a decision that was basically to solidify a very important part of your life, which is your bar mitzvah, then it became a problem.
Yep. And as we'll go on with the conversation tonight, you'll find out that that's not the only rebellious thing.
Right. So now this is, based on what you guys shared, right? So like my brain, I don't know if anyone's have any questions. I see some comments. My mind's going in so many different ways, right? And so the both of you almost kind of, your stories almost the way you just told it, almost around the same age, like before 20 years old, around that time. I want to bring up the 60s a bit. Actually, before we get there, Mrs. Roots.
Yeah.
As a young adult entering in, and I forgot this part, as a young adult entering into the workforce, I guess, or what that looked like, for you, that would be in 1952 is when you started, 1952 is when you became you probably 18 years old. You could say an adult, or whatever, right? So you're talking about the mid 50s. What was that like, for you? If you have any insight on that.
Well, I didn't go in the workforce until the 60s.
Okay.
But when I finished nursing school, they told us that we were going to be hired on P3 status, which meant we were being hired on preferred status because there was such a shortage of nurses. And so we went to work, and we kept getting this paycheck, and they were paying us 50 cents an hour. And I kept saying, well, I thought they said we were going to be hired on P3 status. So I kept waiting for P3 to come through. So I finally went to the office and said, we were told that we were going to be hired on P3 status. So the lady who worked in the office, she actually just passed out the checks. I don't think she had anything to do with anything else. And she said, well, if you don't ask for it, you don't get it. I said, well, I'm here asking, and I expect to get it. So my next paycheck, I had my P3 status.
That
taught me right then and there. If you don't,
nobody looks out for number one, but number one.
If you don't ask for what you want, then you're just probably not going to get anything.
Right.
And it was such a the staff was integrated, and we got along very well, except that we had some incidents that happened with one of the nurses on the 11 to 7 shift. That was her permanent shift. I didn't work that shift all the time. I rotated. But she was as mean as she could be, and I worked on pediatrics. And we had a lot of kids who had their tonsils removed. And I don't know if as a child you had your tonsils taken out, but what the doctors would always promise you that after you had your tonsils out,
your ice cream you can eat.
The ice cream you could eat. Right. And I don't know if they knew how painful it was to try to eat ice cream after you had your tonsils out, but anyway. And they had on the night shift, they always told you to make sure that the children drank a lot during that shift so they could go home the next morning. Well, when she would go around and make her rounds at night, she was so hateful and so mean to those kids. And I actually reported her. But a time passed, they didn't do anything about it. And one night, I guess, some of the parents used to stay over. And I don't guess she knew that this parent was in the room while she was being mean to someone, reported her. And it went from there to the office. And she got reprimanded and she got fired. But when it came, when the word got to us, we were all called in, and all the blacks now, we all called in and told, she's being fired for her activity. But we don't want to hear this another time. If we hear it again, all of you will be fired. Well, if it had been somebody black, the word would have got to the top before the sun rose.
Wow.
But because she was white, that word was not supposed to go any further than that floor. So these are the kinds of things that happen in the workforce during those times too.
So,
they were off limits to everybody else.
So quick question. So what you said is the 60s, Ron, what year was this specifically? Do you remember? Like, was this early 60s, mid 60s?
This was probably around 69, might have been a little bit later, but probably around that time.
Okay. Wow. I think what's interesting is, so take me for example, right? I'm 39 years old as of last week. Our birthdays are close. So I'm June 17th. Fellow June baby. And we hear some of this today, right? Oh, the white person got away with something that, I wouldn't have never gotten away from.
Right.
I would venture to say it may not always be true, but I think it's true enough, and there are instances enough, and I personally have instances that it's occurred in my life where I'm like, man, I know if I did that, that would not have flown. Mm-hmm. I entered the workforce in official workforce as an adult in 2002, at 21 years old. That's a full, you said 1969-ish time frame. So if I'm going to do my math real quick, that's a full 32-year gap. 33-year gap. And the story is similar. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? And I think it's something that we need to be able to highlight about, not saying, and this isn't to say it's just as bad as it was yesterday. I'm not saying that. However, it's interesting to hear that story from you from that so long ago. Mm-hmm. And then I have a similar story, or I can have a similar story. So I want to bridge to Steve real quick. Steve, so.
Can I say something before you go?
Oh, of course, please.
I wanted to mention that the Henrico County here, Steve knows about Henrico County. I always say there are two Henrico counties. There's Henrico County in the east, which is predominantly black or mostly black, and then there's Henrico County in the west.
Short pump.
Now, Henrico County in the east actually sued the school board because of the treatment of the black kids in the school in Henrico County. And it was so blatant. And most of the kids who go to schools here in Richmond, they all know that if there is, I had 4 children, and I think one grandchild who went to school in Henrico County. They have a confrontation in school between a black and a white, the black kid gets sent home for 3 weeks. The white kid gets sent home with a note. And these kind of things went on, and it was so blatant. That's why they had that suit brought against them. And it actually went through the federal court system. So, as much as we think that times are changing, They're not that much changed. And I was telling my daughter the other day, I don't know why we're still spending all this money on busing kids across town to school, and all they do is bus them from one black school to another black school. I have a school that's right there a block and a half from me. And that school they bus kids from 3 separate housing projects. And they probably have about 1,700 kids in that school. And I bet you out of that 1,700, it's hardly 17 kids in that school, but yet they call it integration, and we're busing for integration. There's no integration here in Richmond.
Wow. I appreciate you sharing that. I think what's amazing is that it was not that long ago. The older I get, the younger I feel like I am. And I'm like, man, that was not that long ago. And even here, the difference is like I lived in Richmond for a short period of time. And I lived on the Chesterfield side, right? So I say the Chesterfield side, but you got to live in Richmond, y'all, to get it. So I'm just saying, I was on South Side, so I was in Chesterfield.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I'm on the South Side too, and people look down on that.
They do. But to hear there's 2 different Henricos. It's funny, when I first moved to Richmond, I heard something like that before, and I moved in '98. But I never heard it from this perspective, the way you just, with the school system and the lawsuit. That's amazing. Just to kind of flip a little bit to Steve, after your bar mitzvah, I know, just going into adulthood, some of the things you shared with me on the side and our passing by conversations, like what about you, going into the 60s, into adulthood, what was that like?
Well, so my sister, as I mentioned, I mentioned my wife, but my sister is also a nurse. And my sister went to a community college because, again, we didn't have a lot of money. And, after I put my kids now through school, undergrad and graduate school, and I see all the opportunities that kids have these days, in a middle income family, we didn't have that. And the only way that I was able to go to college after I graduated high school in 1970, the only way I was able to go to college is that the City University of New York developed a program called open enrollment. So if you lived anywhere in New York City, you can go to a college within the New York City school system. So Brooklyn had Brooklyn College, Queens had Queens College, and that's where I went, because at that point we were living in Queens. So I only had the opportunity to go to college because it was open enrollment. My parents didn't have enough money to take out loans or to send me to a better college, so to speak. So I went to the City University School, and I guess I was pushed there because that was my only option. So after 2 years, at the age of, what was I at that point, 16, 17, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I ended up leaving school and, continuing to take my part-time job to a full-time job. And I finished my degree, my undergrad degree, when I was 40 years old in 1992. So I went from elementary school, which was diverse, junior high school, which here they call middle school, which was diverse. Then I went to a diverse high school. And again, either I was the most ignorant person in the world or I didn't know anything about, the race relations that other people had. In other words, I didn't know that that it wasn't common for people to have friends, and very good friends, very close friends, of different denominations. I was brought up that way, that these were the people around me, and either people were good or they were bad. If they were good, it didn't matter what they looked like, what their backgrounds were, you became friendly with them. So when I was 21, this is the story I was telling you the other day. When I was 21, I went to a concert and I met a girl. And she happened to work in the same store that I was working in at the time, and we ended up dating. And then we got serious, and we decided to get engaged. And I told my parents, who knew her. My parents knew we were dating, and I said, I think we're going to get engaged. The problem, the problem I had when I was 13, I had when I was 21, 23. The girl was a Catholic Italian, and we're talking about the early to mid 70s. And forget about inter-race marriages. Interfaith, if you had an interfaith marriage, oh my God, you know, you were going to be excommunicated and kicked out.
A Jew marrying a Catholic does sound like
Yes, and kicked out of the family. And my parents said, "How could you do this?" And I said, "What do you mean? How can I do it?" "Well, she's not Jewish." "Mom, I didn't open her blouse to see if she had a Jewish star on her chest and then recognize she had a star." I said, it was a relationship that developed. And my parents said to me, "Well, are you planning on having kids?" I said, "Well, first let me plan the marriage, but yeah, I would like to have a family." And they said, "Well, how are you going to raise the children?" I said, "Well, I'm going to raise them to be good children and grow up to be good adults and do the right thing all the time." And they said, "Well, what about Jewish or Catholic?" And I said, "Well, you know, I'll be the first to say I'm not an extremely religious person, even though I was brought up in a conservative Jewish environment. And the reason for that is, as the story I told you before about the two sets of dishes, in the Jewish religion, you're not allowed to eat pork because of the way the pigs are slaughtered. It's considered unkosher. It's not kosher food. So you can't eat pork. You're not supposed to. But if you do bring it into the house, when you have two sets of dishes and silverware, if you bring anything that's not kosher into the house, you eat it on paper plates so that you're not breaking the rule of which plate should I use or what. So, you know, as I grew up and I'm thinking about this, and I said, you know, you've heard the phrase, you can't be half pregnant. You either are or you aren't. Yeah. So, you know, I'm saying to myself, well, hang on a second. We have to follow the rules if we're going to be conservative. But if we want to break the rule, we can go do this. And, you know, you can't be half pregnant. So that's the point that I decided, you know, how important is religion in my life? And, you know, it's a faith, it's a belief. You know, I hate to make this analogy, but I guess I will now that I let the cat out of it. It's like Democrat or Republican. It's a belief. It's a belief. You know, you can't tell me a Democrat and a Republican can't marry one another. I'm sure it creates a lot of issues at the dinner table. But, you know, but, you know, religion, if my wife wanted to continue following Catholicism and I wanted to continue following Judaism, which I wasn't doing anyway, because as I started to think about the hypocrisy of how my family brought us up.
Right.
So we ended up getting married, and to satisfy my family and to satisfy her family, we had both a priest and a rabbi do the ceremony.
Wow. So
that was to make everybody happy. I mean, oh, and the kicker of all of this, Mrs. Roots, you'll enjoy this. The kicker of all of this is, so as I said, in those days, you know, a man or a woman who were going to announce that they're going to do an interfaith marriage, their families typically disowned them. My family didn't disown us, but they weren't happy. They weren't happy at all. But 3 weeks before I was going to get married, my cousin, who was going to school to be a psychiatrist, so he was very well educated from a formal education perspective, he announced to the family that he was going to marry a black girl. So I was the greatest thing since sliced bread. At least mine was white.
It's wild, man.
You know, and you know, again, I couldn't. He ended up not marrying her because her family and I guess his parents also, just like my parents didn't approve, but her family and his apparently didn't either. But at least for a few weeks and a few months, like I said, I was the greatest thing since sliced bread.
So I want to comment on that. So like, and Mrs. Roots, I mean, that probably hit you definitely because you lived it. You saw what he's talking about from the black perspective, right? Like, what I find is two things, Steve, in your story. Before I touch the potential black wife, just the religion aspect, right, and the Italian aspect, like those two things, right? And you know, it's amazing to see how the dynamics between I don't want to say dynamics is a strong word. The differences, the biases drive the differences, or the differences drive the biases, right? And then people make decisions on it, right? And I thought it was interesting that every time you bring up a significant thing, right? Like now it's engagement. It's cool to hang with them until you do something that stamps them in place.
Yeah, they didn't think it was going to last because they thought that we were going to figure it out, that, you know what, this is not common and this can't have a good ending. But we fooled. Well, it didn't have a good ending, unfortunately, but not for those reasons. not
Right.
for those reasons. We were only married for, I think, maybe 3 years, but it had nothing to do with religion or anything of that nature. But I'll tell you what, they make some pretty darn good meatballs.
Hey, did you use a different plate for the meatballs?
Listen, once I moved out of my house, it was one set of dishes and one set of silverware.
That's it.
And,
So
and, well, look, I had the best of both worlds. I got to celebrate Christmas and Hanukkah.
I know you love that. So the black wife, and this, Miss Roots, I'm going to lead this into you real quick because I want to touch on something. What I found is interesting is that there are levels to the biasness, right? So you were engaged to an Italian who was a Catholic, and it was your brother, you said, right?
My cousin.
Your cousin brought home a black woman, and all of a sudden you were pushed, like he made the worst mistake. So like it's almost, so what I think is interesting is that people see color.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we know
And
that.
I think it's important when people say, I don't see color,
Mm-hmm.
because at the end of the day, once they, like, let's look, you're Jewish, and most Jewish, at least from what I've heard and learned, they don't want to necessarily be called white, but you're Jewish, and if you came here, you're going to be in the white category just based on the way you look, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless you really know what that person's Italian, like they open up their mouth, they say something, you can look at features, they're going to look white. You bring a black girl home, it's pretty straightforward, right? And so I find it unfortunate, but it's amazing that there's levels to this biasness, which I'm just going to call it what it is. It's levels of racism, right? It's almost like basically saying, like you said, beliefs, right? You can believe what I believe, and if you look like me, you're cool. If you don't look like me, you may believe what I believe, but we're not on the same page. I don't know. It's just interesting. So, Mrs. Roots.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. Oh, by the way, when you did your panel with Jason the other day, you mentioned that it's assumed that most Jews are rich. I got to tell you something. I don't fit that mold. Yeah. But here's the kicker of the story, and I think, from my perspective, it had even though the marriage didn't last long, but the story is a happy ending because my dad passed away, and my mom had been working in Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx. And she met at that point we were in Queens, so she was working in Elmhurst Hospital, and she met a X-ray technician, and she was dating him for a few months. And when I got divorced, I had my own apartment, and every couple of weeks my mom would invite me over for dinner, and I'd go to dinner or I'd take her out to dinner. So one day she calls me and says, "Can you come over for dinner tonight?" I said, "Sure." So I went over, I had sat down with her and was sitting at the table, and she's sitting opposite me, and I could see, she looked sad. So I said, "What, is anything wrong?" She said, "Well, I have something to tell you." And I said, "What is it?" She said, "Well, your dad passed away a couple of years ago, and I've been seeing this guy that I'm working with in the hospital. He runs the X-ray department." I said, "Oh, that's great. What's he like? Is he good to you?" And I could see tears running down her face. I said, "Mom, is he not good to you? Is there something wrong that I need to know?" And she, "No, he's very good to me." And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" She said, "He's black." And I said, "But what's the problem?" And she just started, when I asked her what's the problem after that, she just started bawling. I said, "Mom, did he hurt you in any way?" She said, "No." I said, "Why? He's hysterical." She said, "Because Dad and I gave you such a difficult time when you brought my first wife home. Her name was Donna. When you brought Donna home, and we gave you such a difficult time about that." And I said, "Mom, look, I understand where you were coming from, but what you just told me and the way you feel now, doesn't it make you feel that maybe I was right, that maybe somebody's look, somebody's religion is not necessarily, is not at all more important than who they are as individuals?" And, then over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, I met this gentleman. He's a great guy. In fact, I was telling Matt the other day, if I close my eyes and listen to Ben Carson sounds just like my mom's boyfriend. His name was Alvin Adams. And he has a very soft voice, very soft spoken, but what a gentleman he was. And they traveled all around the world. He would stay over my mom's house. She would stay at his house. I can't tell you how many times he asked her to marry him, and she said no for two reasons, and I believe the two reasons that she gave me. She said, number one, your father would be rolling over in his grave. And I said, well, let him roll over and keep digging. But more importantly, no, they because at this point they were in their early 70s, and mom said, I really don't want to bury another man.
Oh, wow.
So they traveled the world together. He took her to places unbelievable. And as I said, they stayed over each other's houses when necessary. But now is the bad part of the story. And I did mention this to you once before, Matt. So whenever we had family functions, Thanksgiving or a Hanukkah dinner or a barbecue, and members of my family would have it at their homes, they would invite my mother. They didn't want Al to come.
Oh, gee.
They didn't want Al to come. And so my mom never went. And go ahead.
What year was this?
That was in 70. I got divorced in 75. That was, my dad passed in 79. So that was the early 80s.
That's
the early 80s.
That's critical. But go ahead. I'm sorry. And then I want to bridge to Mrs. Roots in a second.
So
go ahead.
We only had one relative that had his own home. Everybody else lived in apartments throughout the city. So the one guy that had a home, whenever we had a big event at his house, Al wasn't invited. And this uncle had 2 daughters and a son. Turns out one daughter ended up marrying a Puerto Rican, and one daughter turned out to be gay. So, you know, they thought they had the perfect lifestyle, and they thought that everybody was going to grow up and believe the way they believed. And unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, I could care less how they grew up as long as they were happy. But it just goes to show that people from that side of it, from that generation, from backgrounds like my family had, it's all messed up. Wow. It's all messed up. And I feel, you know, I've said over and over, I feel very fortunate that I grew up in the projects so that I didn't see any of that. And I judge people today not by what they look like or how they speak, but whether or not they're good people.
That's good, man. I really appreciate that. So I want to bridge over to Miss Roots. So I know when you had, we were talking about the workforce, how is it transitioning out as you got older? I mean, I know you had some pieces of information around that as well. So after some of the issues that were happening with you as a nurse and what you were involved in, you know, what was that like? And that was in the late 60s, correct? Late 60s, early 70s?
Yeah, well, you know, it was just such an amicable bunch of people that we got along very well on the job, and we socialized together, and we would go, but you know, and I've always found this a little bit different too. It's something about white people that I think they just don't get it. And we used to socialize, and we played. We used to love to play games, and every Christmas we'd have a Christmas party. Everybody would go, and we were just one big happy group. And if we played, like we would have Pokina night, and everybody would go to everybody's house. The whites would always come to the black people's houses, but they never invited us to their houses. So I always thought that, well, why are we always the one that's trying to be the friend, if you know what I mean? And I think one thing, and people say they're not racist and they don't understand, they don't believe when we talk about the way we are treated. But and I guess that's why I'm a little bit defiant. And I guess sometimes it seems like I carry a chip on my shoulder because I don't believe in letting people walk over you. And so I'm telling you, I've had a lot of these experiences. I've been going into like a department store, and a white man opens the door and goes in, and he looks back and sees me, and he just almost slams the door in my face instead of holding the door open and letting me come in. And I was in Cracker Barrel one day, standing in line, waiting to pay my ticket because I had finished eating. This woman walked up in front of me, just walked right in front of me like I wasn't there. And I said, "Excuse me?" She looked at me. She said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Yes. Don't you see me standing here?" oh, you're in line. I said, why do you think I'm here? And it's just things like that. Like she couldn't see me. I was invisible. I didn't count. I wasn't even human. Like I was a ghost. Those kind of things that make you, say.
I have a real head scratcher also, and I'm gonna read this because it's something that somebody brought to my attention last week, and this is about an Ohio lawmaker who also happens to be a physician by degree, a doctor by degree. So you would think that he's school educated, but education doesn't always mean school education, and so I'm gonna. And when I heard this, I just could not believe it. And it actually, this statement that I'm about to read, he made this between Mr. Floyd's murder and Mr. Brooks' killing. So it happened right in between those two. I'm going to read this from the New York Times. An Ohio lawmaker was fired from his job as a physician. He was fired from his physician position, but he was still a senator. He was fired from his job as a physician on Thursday after asking at a hearing this week if the high rate of coronavirus cases among African Americans was because, and I'm quoting what he asked, the question, I'm quoting exactly his word, was it because the colored population did not wash their hands as well as other groups? And this was 3 weeks ago. And when my friend brought this this is a guy who was an Ohio senator. He's an Ohio senator who was also, by education, he was a doctor. And I'm saying to myself, this is 2020. When do people say things like this, for God's sake, or even think things? Forget about saying it. How could they even think these things?
I saw that on TV. I don't know if it was CNN or MSNBC, but I actually saw that.
And his name,
the one where the woman walking her dog in Central Park and the bird watcher.
Yep, the bird watch. Yep.
On the lease, and she's like, "Oh, I'm going to call the police and tell them that this black man is threatening me and harassing me." And the key word, black man. She knew those two words were going to get the police there, but I guess they didn't come in a timely manner, because by the time the policeman got there, the black man had gone and she had too. So she got fired from her job too, which she should have been.
Yep, and she was also, again, school educated, but that school education has nothing to do with social education, has absolutely nothing to do with it.
Yeah, so let me ask you this, and that's huge. I mean, Mrs. Roots, let me ask you this question, and Steve, you can comment after she answers as well. It's a two-part question. The first part is, like you mentioned, the Cracker Barrel. When did you say when that was? The Cracker Barrel situation? Do you remember?
Oh, it's not like it was 10 years ago. It hasn't been that long ago. But I mean, it didn't matter whether it was Cracker Barrel or anywhere else. That white woman, just like I was invisible, like she didn't care that I was standing there.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't understand. I just don't understand people. I really don't.
Do you feel like when you see what's going on today, right? And then you compare it to what's happened yesterday, right? When I say yesterday, 40, 50 years ago, for you, Mrs. Roots, what's the difference for you? Like, from your perspective, what's the difference? Have we improved? You know what?
I actually, looking back at what I'm seeing now, we've gone back, if not the 60s, we've gone all the way back to the 50s almost. That's just how bad things are. And I comment all the time, the only reason why all of this is coming to the forefront now is because everybody has a phone and everybody has a camera, and all this stuff that's just been hidden or not seen is actually coming up. But people haven't changed. I have a friend who lives in Midlothian. They're a black couple. Her husband started to losing the pigmentation in his skin after he got in his 40s or something like that. And they live in this community. There's very few blacks in Midlothian where they live. And it was this white girl that she walked, like some people walk a couple of miles in the morning or evening, whatever. She walked and he walked too for exercise. And they walked together and talked together for a long time until, I don't know how she found out that he was black. But the minute she found out he was black, she stopped walking. And if she walked, she didn't walk with him. And that's just this, it's just sad that because I have a dark skin and you're white or whatever, they don't see you.
Yeah.
They don't want to have anything to do with you just because of the color of your skin. And I said, it's so sad. And unless you can put all kind of laws and into effect, and this is unlawful and that is unlawful. But you got those same people who hated you 30 years ago, they still hate you, and they don't know any reason why they hate you except that the color of your skin. And
Yeah.
the commentary.
And she's 100% right. The laws don't change people. The laws just change what they're supposed to follow. Here's a great example. You're driving down I-95. The speed limit is 65. You're going 75, maybe close to 80. Over 80 is reckless driving. But let's say you're going 75 and somebody says, there's a cop down the road. So you slow down. You slow down because you're going to get caught. And then once you're out of the cop's view, you keep going up again at 75, maybe close to 80 miles an hour. And it's the same thing with laws. People follow them unless they know they can get away with something else. So that's why it's either inherent in the person to be good or it's inherent to the person to be bad. And if the person is going to be bad, you can make all the laws you want, but where there's a will, there's a way. You get a burglar alarm for your house, they'll figure out how to get through it.
Oh, yeah.
And Matt, I keep telling you, I keep praising you about these civil conversations. A long time ago, a civics teacher that I had said, bureaucracy moves incrementally. And, these civil conversations aren't going to change the world, but every conversation we have and the more people that listen to it, incrementally, it's going to make a difference. Now, again, we're not going to save the world, but these are extremely valuable conversations. And that's why not only should you continue them, but we should make everybody aware of them, because it takes this type of dialogue to understand what people are all about and how we need to change to make society better. Because you can go to school for 25 years. It doesn't make you any smarter socially. It just makes you smarter book-wise.
Yeah, I think, first off, thank you. I appreciate the compliment there. I think it's super important to have these conversations. One of the reasons why I created and started this, and it was very random. I mean, Jessica and Tim can tell you, it was very random. I just asked them, hey, you want to do this talk? I just felt like conversations need to be had, and we need to take the media out of the discussion. I'm not sitting here having a political conversation. I'm being honest. The media has stolen all of our abilities to tell our own stories and to have our own conversations. And we need to stop looking at the screen and start looking to our left and right. I mean, obviously we're all looking at a screen now, and having a conversation with our neighbor, our coworkers, our fellow church members, so that when we can develop a love for people that are near us on a day-to-day basis. That way, when we look at what the news is saying, no matter what your color is, you can deny it, right? Because you know what the truth is, or you have to accept some of it, and then maybe hopefully not try to bring that into your world, but at least that you have a better understanding of what's going on with the people next to you. I want to ask a question of you both, and I'm referencing this around the 60s, right? There were several major incidences that happened in the 60s, but there were 3 deaths specifically. There was JFK. I'm doing them in order, right? There was JFK, there was Malcolm X, and then there was Martin Luther King. And I've always kind of wondered, I've spoken to a few people, what was that like, right? So I know, Steve, for you were a kid, and you're in the North. That's a different perspective than you, Mrs. Roots, and I'm going to give you the opportunity first to answer. Like, what was life like when these things happened, right? For you as an African-American woman living in Virginia?
Well, I often say, when I was doing domestic work when JFK was assassinated, and I compare that to the time that when Barack Obama was nominated and elected to be the president of the United States. I think JFK, when he got to be president, it was like the black people said, oh, we have something to hope for. We're going to see some changes because, you had the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all that kind of stuff. And it was like, things are going to be so much better. And it was the same thing with Barack Obama. And it just seemed like everybody was on their best behavior. At that time, people would hold the door for you, open the car door for you, whatever. And everybody was just as friendly as they could be. And it just seems like, I never forget that day. And he got assassinated. I was working down a place called Fulton in the East End. I just packed my stuff up. I didn't tell anybody I was going home. I just packed myself up and I went home. And it was so sad. And it just seemed like from that day on, this United States started to go into hell in handbasket. I mean, the morals just went into decay. And it was just like nobody cared about anybody. Nobody cared about anything. And it just reverted back almost to the way back to the dark ages. And then after Martin Luther King was assassinated and Bobby, I don't know, it just seemed like the world was not the same anymore. And seems like we stopped making progress at that point. I didn't see anything to be so hopeful for until Barack Obama became president. But that was just like a time of moral decay for me.
Really? So when you say Bobby, you're talking about Bobby Kennedy, right?
Bobby Kennedy when he was a couple of months after MLK.
Yeah. Because I think he was shot after a rally, right? Like he was in the back of the kitchen.
In California. He had just won the primary in California.
Yeah. And that's that's why I think what you said is like you felt like the 60s. We went into like a moral decay after all of that, like after the 60s. And what's interesting is that like when you say that, it makes me think, and I'm not sure if anyone else is thinking the same thing on comments or whatever, but just from my perspective, right? I'm born in 81. So you guys had lived a life before I even showed up. But
You keep rubbing that in.
Isn't that the point of the show? But what I think is interesting is that the laws had changed. And I think to your point, Steve, earlier about laws, it's interesting that from your perspective, Mrs. Roos, right, around how you felt like we went into like a moral decay, but yet very important laws for minorities were put in place in the late 60s going into the 70s to help hopefully rectify some of this. So but then Steve, you bring up a point about the law and how the laws don't necessarily change people, but yet we put laws in place to help change people. I'm not going anywhere with my point, but it's just a revelation, I guess. I'm just realizing like, wow, like the dynamics between the two. It's pretty interesting.
Well, when you think about it, even now, if you watch television and you see all these states like Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, where even though we have a right to vote, they find a way to close down all these polling places and make people stand in line for 6 hours for voter suppression, or you get to the poll and your name's been taken off, or you're in the wrong place. You got to go across town somewhere, or the voting machines don't work. These are tactics from way back in the 50s when you had to pay a poll tax to vote, and then you had to almost recite the Constitution backwards and forward. I mean, just all kind of stumbling blocks that they put in your way. And we're almost at that point now in some of these states. You know,
it's frightening. This is a frightening time. This is a frightening time, no doubt.
Really? Yeah. So Steve, let me ask you this question. So what was it like in the Northeast for you? I know a little bit of this story when Dr. King passed.
Sure. So when Dr. King passed in 68, so I was 16 years old. And, again, as a 16-year-old, I don't know, maybe the kids nowadays at that age are a little bit more aware, obviously with all of the cable channels and everything. But in those days, there was ABC, CBS, and NBC. Those are your options.
Right.
So when Martin Luther King was killed, that particular day, he was killed, I think, either late afternoon or early evening. I think it was early evening. And my parents and my best friend at that time, his parents, both sets of parents took us to buy 10-speed bicycles. And I'm living in the Bronx on near Yankee Stadium. And we went to buy our bicycles, and the parents said, we'll put them on top of the car and we'll drive them home. And my friend and I said, no, we'll ride them home. So they said, are you sure? We said, yeah, we'll ride them home. We won't be home too late. So we started riding, and I said, well, let's not go right home. Let's take a little bit of a detour. There you go, the rebellion again. So let's take a little bit of a detour. So we drove towards Yankee Stadium, and right behind Yankee Stadium, it's what's known as the 161st Street Bridge, because Yankee Stadium at that time, it still is on 161st Street. Sorry, Jason. So we rode over the 161st Street Bridge, and at that point, Martin Luther King had been dead a couple of hours. But on the other side of the bridge was Harlem. And I knew it was Harlem. I had no problem riding over there, but we didn't know about the death of Dr. King. And at that point, there were police on with helmets and riot gear on the other side. And my buddy and I were riding over, and we thought maybe it's for a movie. We didn't have a clue what it was for until we saw a rush of crowds from the Harlem side come after us, and we immediately turned around. Unfortunately, my friend, the rioters got him and beat the heck out of him, but the cops, I sent a couple of cops over, and they got him out. But that was a traumatic time. And again, I didn't understand the value that Dr. King brought to the table. I didn't know his story. Obviously I've since learned a lot, but it was something that when they told me who Dr. King was and what he stood for and what he had accomplished in his life, I didn't know anything about it up until that point.
So what's interesting is probably from a northern, I know not everybody's story in the Northeast is exactly the same, right? So you are just one guy, but I find it interesting that you didn't fully hear anything or know much about Martin Luther King at all. But then when your friend got caught by the riot, and that was a black crowd, right? Obviously. Yeah. It's okay to say it was a black crowd. I mean, I'm sure they were, pissed off at what happened. Do you understand the rage? Why that happened? Why? I'm not saying it was okay.
Not at the moment. Obviously not at the moment.
No, not at the moment. I'm saying looking back. Did you understand?
Oh, 100%. 100%.
Yeah, you did?
No doubt. And I even had to self-educate myself about Malcolm X, because when Malcolm X was killed, it was on the news. He was killed in New York. It was on the news, and the bulletin came on, and I said to my mom and dad, "Who's Malcolm X?" Again, I wasn't someone. Again, back in those days, three news stations. You had the daily newspaper, and you had the New York Post. I didn't read anything other than the sports pages, Jason, to see if the Yankees won or lost. But I didn't read the news. I didn't understand it all. I was reading sports, and I was playing sports, and I was having a good old time. And sports and news wasn't as prevalent, and there weren't as many choices in those days. But obviously as the story went on, and just as an aside, one of my idols was Elvis Presley. I just loved his music. I loved his movies. I'm aging myself, but that's okay. You already know how old I am. And for my 60th birthday, my daughter, knowing how much I loved Elvis Presley, took me on a trip to Graceland. That was the only thing on my bucket list before I'll kick the bucket. So she took me to Graceland, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. And it was a 3-day weekend that we went, and we were going to go to Graceland to see different things each of those days. Well, one evening we decided to drive around, and we're driving around. We had no idea we were going. St. Jude's has their main hospital in Memphis, so we went to St. Jude's Hospital and saw that. But then we're driving around, and all of a sudden I see a sign that says Lorraine Hotel around the corner. So I said to my daughter, "Oh my God, Lorraine Hotel, we're in Memphis. That's where Dr. King was killed." So we drove around, and the motel obviously is closed now, but it was kept in the same style and fashion. And the cars that were parked there the day he was shot are still there. And there's a fence, protecting the property, so you really can't go in the parking lot or in the hotel. But I was within 25 yards of where Dr. King was killed. And and I'm getting the chills just telling you the story, because it was so emotional. It was so emotional knowing now as an adult about his story and standing there 25 yards from where he was killed. And in my mind, I could see the Reverend Jesse Jackson pointing, to where he believed the shot. And I'm reliving this in my mind. And I got to tell you something, it was extremely emotional. I
appreciate you sharing that perspective, especially because you had basically two aspects of your life, right? One where people are reacting to the death immediately and your friend gets jumped. And then fast forward, you said you're 16, so fast forward 44 years later, you're standing where he was killed, and that meant something to you. And a lot of that meant something to you because at one point you had no knowledge, and at another point you had knowledge. And I think that's critical for everyone to understand, is that willful ignorance is very dangerous. So that's why it's important to be educated and have knowledge, right? And not saying you were willfully ignorant, you were not. However, I think when we refuse to inform ourselves and get educated on certain things, we miss out on being able to connect with people at a deeper level that we probably haven't even couldn't imagine.
I watch Dr. Phil a lot. I watch a lot of talk shows. I'm very selective, and I listen to a lot of talk shows on the radio and podcasts. And one of the things that Dr. Phil drives home is you cannot correct what you don't acknowledge.
That's fair. You can't.
Cannot correct what you don't acknowledge.
That's very fair.
And until people understand that, they're just pulling the wool over other people's eyes and themselves.
Yeah. So, Mrs. Roots, with all that, obviously Steve said, but moving towards you, what about for you? Like, how do you feel? I know you mentioned the moral decay, but moving forward as an adult and having children and having grandchildren, what is life? What is your perspective of the last 40 years? You can share some of what you already probably prepped or whatever, but what is your perspective of the last 40 years and things that you've been through that shaped who you are today?
Well, I guess I found out early what hate was. And I try not to let it define me. That's why I say it may seem like I'm walking around with a chip on my shoulder. I'm really not. And I try to teach my children that always remember to treat people the way you want to be treated. And I came from a big family. My mom and dad had 8 children. And we were poor, but I have always felt like I was rich. When we lived in West Virginia, we had a big house, had about 5 bedrooms to it. And my dad was a brick mason. He was a cement finisher. And most of those, Steve, you might know, downtown, the Federal Reserve buildings, and almost all of those tall buildings that you see downtown on Main Street, Franklin Street, and all in it, my dad helped build almost every one of those buildings.
Wow.
But we didn't have any money because my mom had 8 kids and my dad was the only one working. And before he started to doing that, he worked in the shipyard in Newport News. And way back then, it was hard to find work because, the Depression came along like in the 30s. And so it was hard for him to find work, but he always managed to have a job. And my dad always said, people used to say, Fred, you sure do have a lot of kids. He said, well, that's okay. If you have 1, you'll give that 1 all you got. If you have 8, you'll divide what you have among those 8 children. And we had all around the house, we had peach trees all around. We had apple trees. And in the summer, we had everything you could plant. And I never known my mom to go to the store and buy anything except salt and lard, because they canned everything. Yeah. And we had food summer, winter, spring, and fall, and didn't have to buy anything. And when we left West Virginia and came to Richmond, that's when my dad left the shipyard and came to work. And I had my children, I said, right now, I just feel like the richest person in the world. I tell people I don't have a fancy house. I don't have a fancy car, but I have the good Lord, and I know him, and he knows me, and I'm on his side, and he looks out for me. And like I say, if these people who hate you because of the color of their skin, they're going to be shocked when they get to the pearly gates and have to answer for their sins, that they didn't love mankind like the Lord said, love your neighbor as yourself. And these last few weeks have shown me, I've learned a lot. Even though I'm old now, I've learned a lot about people that it's surprising. I did a thing on YouTube about gentrification, and I was telling people that when I was growing up, or when I was raising my children, we had what you call a neighborhood. And the neighbors knew who their neighbors were. And it was like, if you needed something, I could go to your house and say, I don't have any flour. Can you let me have a cup of flour until I get to the store? And that kind of thing, that's how we grew up. But now, people don't know who their neighbors are. They don't speak. I got a neighbor on the corner up there for me. They've been there about 30-some years. I wouldn't know those people if they walk right in. But, you know, it's just a difference. And just in these last few weeks, I have a couple who lives on this side of me. They moved up here from Florida. And because of when that George Floyd murder happened, I think that was an eye-opener for them, as much as it has been for a whole lot of people in these United States. And I think they actually felt bad. And I guess they thought they needed to come to me almost to confess their sins. But I mean, that's just the way it seemed like. 'Cause they wrote me this letter, and they bought me flowers. They bought me fruit, and the little kids, one is 2, and I think the other one is 3 or 4. They made cards themselves, and just talked about how sorry they were that things were going on in the neighborhood. I mean, not in the neighborhood, going on, you know, with the children and all. And I don't know if they felt responsible or just what it was, but it just seemed like they were so sorrowful. Well, I was just as sorrowful as they were, because, I mean, you have no right to kill anybody. And so they are, and I think too, they know the Lord. They're church-going people. They go to church. But these people who still hate, and like Martin Luther King says, 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated time in the United States, because if you go into these churches, and I live in I live in the East End, we call it Church Hill. And it's a church on almost every corner in Church Hill. Well, you shouldn't have any sinners there. Everybody ought to be going to church. But I mean, you know, you go to church and still don't, you got a lot of people in church, but they don't have any church in them. And I think that's what needs to happen. These people have got to get some church in them, and the laws that they make or fail to make, where you can just kill a man just because you have a gun and a badge, you got to change some hearts. They need some come to Jesus meetings so this world can change. And this I will always believe, this pandemic that we're going through now, God is doing this. He's trying to tell us something, and we better start listening. It's like he said, love your neighbor as yourself. And you, instead of loving your neighbor, you're killing your neighbor. That's not what God wants. And they're going to, before this pandemic is over, they're going to listen. Might take them a long time to learn. And this pandemic is not going away. Donald Trump think it got hot, and when it gets hot, that the heat is going to kill it. He's just a jackass, and he don't know no better. But they better listen, because we need to be praying for the Lord to come and heal the land. And that's what he said. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then will they hear from heaven, and I will heal their land. And I pray for healing every day, because I know that's the only thing that's going to get us out of this situation that we're in. So gotta learn how to love in spite of the color of your skin.
I love the perspective you're given in multiple layers. And Steve, you can respond as well.
I can't top that. I can't top that.
Yeah, I mean, it's
beautiful.
Well, it wasn't it. It was just real. And we're gonna walk through that for those who, I mean, I think people know that I'm also a believer, but I think it's important, the dynamics you gave in regards to the way people started treating you after the George Floyd situation. At 86 years old, and I'm 39, and I had the same feeling. I was kind of like, whoa, like what's everybody doing? Is everybody sorry about something? What's going on? You know what I mean? And it's just they're all coming at me, and I think it's hard because there's a part of us as African Americans, and Steve, I'll just share this with you, where we're like, I'm just tired, and I don't want to be responsible for educating white America. At the same time, you almost have to be gracious, right? Because there are some people who are just trying to learn. Now, some people just want to learn in order to defend their stance, but I think some of them really are just trying to learn. And the fact that they did that to you and that still had an impact to you, meaning like, bringing the flower, I think you said the flowers and stuff like that, and the cards for you, that says a lot, and then moving that into the beauty of loving your neighbor and what that means in scripture and what that means for people to understand that they need a walk with God in order to be able to attain healing. And like you said, Churchill really should be sinless, but we all know it's not. We all know it's not. We all know it's not. I want to say this one thing. I know we didn't really go into questions. I think there were a lot of comments. But I do want to, from both of you guys' perspective, to kind of close this off, because I intentionally thought, I didn't post this out there, I figured it would be about 90 minutes or so. I want to go to Steve real quick. When you came to the South, and again, this is the last thing before we wrap up. When you came to the South, I know you told me one story last night. I thought that was, I think actually that's what you should share. I'm talking about the security.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
What was an eye opener for you? Because you're from the North, you dealt with racial biases, but you didn't live in the South where it was a part of lifestyle, especially where the laws were in place. What?
Well, when my wife and I, after we had gotten married, I left Standard. I left Standard and I got a job in Long Island, and we were living in Queens at the time, and she got a job in Long Island as well. So we ended up moving to Long Island so we'd both be closer to our jobs. And Long Island is very different than the city, and people, just like today, people think, they say, gee, you're telling me you're not from the South? I would swear you're from the South. I said, you got to be kidding. The way I speak, you think I come from the South?
No, at 68, you still sound like you just got picked up off of like Brooklyn or something, man. Like
off the E train. So when we moved to Long Island, I stood out very different because of the way I speak. And out in Long Island, it's very proper and blah, blah, blah. And I told, they said, where are you from? And I said, well, I grew up in Fort Apache. Then we moved to Queens. And I said, you heard of Fort Apache in the Bronx, didn't you? They made a movie out of it. And they said, well, that was just a movie. That's not real, was it? Yeah, that was real. So, then we ended up, my job relocated me to I told you, Waco, Texas. And when my wife went down there for a look around to see if we actually wanted to make the move, they hooked us up with a real estate agent, and they put us in the only hotel in Waco, which was the Hilton, and it was probably about 30 stories. So the real estate agent came and said, I'll meet you at the hotel. I'll come up to your room and we'll talk about what you may be looking for. We had a great view of the entire city of Waco, and there's a river there called the Lake Brazos River. Mm-hmm. So she's showing me from the view from our room. She's saying, well, you may want to live in that area. You don't want to live across the river. And I said, why? Is there pollution there or something? She said, no, that's where the other people live.
Oh.
I said, what do you mean? Is this is like a, and I know in Hawaii they have a leper colony. I said, are the lepers there? They said, no, they said, no, the other people. And I said, no, I don't know what you mean. And she said, it's mostly a black population. And I said, well, why do you call it the other people? And she had no answer because she was from the South. But then we moved to Virginia. And again, it's more north and east than Waco, Texas, but it's still the South. And you still see the old biases, the old inequalities that, they were years ago that still exist. And the story that Matt was alluding to is up until a few years ago when I considered myself old. So when I was younger, in my 50s, I used to ask older people that I meet on the street or that I would work, say, as a Southerner, what's the most life-changing event in your lifetime? As growing up in the North, the most life-changing event, there were 2 or 3 of them, and one obviously was John Kennedy, the other was Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. But the John Kennedy was the most life-shattering for me because I was only 12 years old when he was killed, and I remember getting on the school bus, say hi to the bus driver that I did every afternoon, and he said, "Did you hear the president was killed?" And as a 12-year-old, I thought he was kidding, and I laughed until I got home. So I like to ask older people, what's the biggest life event in your lifetime? Just like for most of the kids, most of the people that are my children's ages, probably 9/11 is probably the most shocking event. And I said to this gentleman who was a security guard where we work, and he was brought up in the South near Petersburg, Virginia, and he's a good old Southern boy and a white guy. And I said, Jesse, what's the most life-changing event to this day? And he was in his 70s at that time. I said, Jesse, what's the most life-changing event in your lifetime? And he looked at me and he said, Steve, I never thought I'd drink out of the same water fountain as a black person or go to the same bathroom as a black person. And my jaw hit the ground. I could not believe that he said that to me, although I knew it existed. But until I met somebody who experienced that, I guess it was a reality check for me. And it was shocking, true, but shocking.
I want to pause there because I think this is a beautiful bridge to you, Mrs. Roots. And this is, when do you think this, do you remember around the time that this was for you, Steve, when you spoke to him?
I started working there in 94, so it was probably close to 99.
Close to 99. Okay, close to 99. Which is amazing, right? That for him as a white guy, that was a monumental thing for him. He shared a water fountain and used the same bathroom as a black person. To flip to you, Mrs. Roots, what was it like, right? When you think about having to have these lines of separation, you covered it somewhat earlier. What was that like for you? Starting to share with white people. I mean, did you like kind of like stay away from it a little bit, and you weren't sure?
You know what? I never really gave any of that a whole lot of thought.
Okay.
I'm gonna tell you why. I am number one. I don't think anybody on this earth is any more important than I am. And this is the way I feel about it. I'm just the way I am. I don't care what color you are. I can get along with you. I can work with you. I can socialize with you. But I'm going to give you as much as you give me. If you show me that you are a true friend, you like me, you love me, or whatever, that's fine. I'm going to be just as truthful and just as friendly to you as you are to me. But if you're one of those people that you think you up here and I'm down here, then we're not going to get along very well. And I'm going to let you know, you think you hot stuff? Well, baby, I think I'm hotter than you are. So you can stay in your place and I'll stay in mine. So I really had a lot of confrontation as far as black and white. I remember the signs vividly. But I tell you, my mom you didn't know whether she was white or black, because she was really, really white. But I never forget, my dad tried to take her to the movies one night, and they got to the movies and they told my dad, "You can't bring her in here." So it just goes to show you what people see. It's just what they see on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that matter? It's not what's on the outside, it's what's on the inside. So, these are the things that, like I say, it probably hurt her. It probably hurt him too. Yeah. But
I have 3 friends, and living here in Virginia now for almost 28 years. I know a lot of people. I know a lot of people from all walks of life, but I use the word friend very carefully. I value the word friend, and my number one friend is my wife. And by the way, she made me say that. Matthew is number 2, even though that we haven't been physically in the same place in a very long time, but we have a special connection, I believe. And I have another friend in Atlanta who I work with. I actually hired the gentleman, and we became very good friends. So that's it. You can talk to people and find out what they're about, but they're only going to tell you and show what they want you to hear. If you ask people about, is this guy the same as this guy? Yeah, everybody's created equal. When you walk away, you find out what they really believe is everybody is created equal, but some are created more equal than others. Mm. And those are the phonies that I don't want to have anything to do with.
Mm.
Well, when I did that thing for the gentrification, it's a white couple that lives across the street on the corner from me, and I think they moved here from Pennsylvania. Well, in my interview, I was saying, like I was talking about the neighbors not being neighbors anymore. So this was, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 weeks after he went on Facebook. I was sweeping off the front porch, and I saw this lady coming across the street, and she was kind of doing like this, trying to see around the bush.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "I'm looking for Miss Roots." I said, "That's me." And she came on in the yard and came up on the porch. She said, "Well, I live across the street over there on the corner, my husband and I." She said, "And I just came over here to let you know that you do have a neighbor."
Mm.
She said, "I told my husband," she said, "when I started," she said, "I told my husband, I'm going to find this lady." And she said, "I want you to know that you do have a neighbor." She said, "And I'm going to give you my phone number and my husband's phone number. And if you ever need either one of us for anything, you just call us and we are your neighbors and we'll be right over here to do whatever we can for you." And that's what the couple did that live on the other side of me. But like I said, there are some good people whose hearts are good, and there are some who are going to hell hating. And that's just, it's just the way it is. And
Yes.
they don't know why they don't like you. If you ask them the reason why, they probably don't even have an answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to close off, I want to, first off, you guys, are absolutely amazing. I don't even have words to describe the knowledge, the experience, the wisdom you guys have shared on this call. I want to give y'all both an opportunity, maybe just to say, is there anything else you'd like to address us young folks about? Or if there are any questions or whatever you have for each other, but look, anything that you guys would like to say before we close out? Mrs. Roots, again, I'm a ladies first person, so anything?
Well, I'll just say thank you for the opportunity to express some of my feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And my children always say, "Don't ask Mama what you think if you don't want to know, because she's certainly going to tell you." Mm-hmm. And I tell them and I tell everybody else, I'm going to tell you what I mean, and I'm going to mean what I say.
Mm.
So I'm just being truthful when I tell you these things today. But the life that I have, I wouldn't trade for anything in this world. I tell you, I went out to take, like I said, I had a birthday a couple of days ago, and when I was telling my youngest daughter that I didn't know what I was going to do because I've been sick, and I said, normally what I do, I just cook and cook and cook, and I'll just say, everybody come. And they said, well, Mama, you sure you don't want us to bring anything? I said, no, just come and bring yourself. But I said, this time I'm not feeling well, and I'm kind of wondering if I'll cook something. And I have this guy, he's a caterer. I said, maybe I'll cook some and I'll get Mr. Woody to cook some. So my youngest daughter said, don't worry about it. I got this. So when people started calling me and asking me, what are you going to do for your birthday? I said, I'm not doing anything. I said, Michelle told me I got this, so she got it. So Beverly, her mom, she asked me on Monday, she said, Mama, she said, what are you going to do for your birthday? I said, I don't have anything planned. I said, Shelley said she got this, so I'm letting Shelley have this. So she said, well, I'm coming on Wednesday, and I'm going to bring you dinner. She said, what do you want to eat? So I said, well, I'll tell you what, go to Red Lobster and get me the Admiral's Feast, and go to Olive Garden and get me a big salad. So she said, well, what time do you want to eat? I said, about 5 o'clock. She said, okay. So I normally try to take a nap at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but I guess I was so excited by 4:15, I hadn't been sleeping. I just said, well, I better get up because Pip is going to be here at 5. So I got up, and it was when 5 o'clock came, I got restless because she wasn't there. So about 10 minutes after 5, I walked to the door. She was parking on the other side of the street. And so she came on in the house, she bought the food, and we sat. I sat at that end of the table, she sat at this end. So as soon as she sat down, her phone rang. She got up to go answer the phone, and she came back. She said, Mom, Reverend Wilkins said to tell you happy birthday. I said, tell her I said, thank you. So she sat back down, the phone rang again. She got back up again. She went in the den and she came back. She said, you go and start because looks like my phone is not going to start ringing. So anyway, I went on, said my grace, and started to eat. And I got about halfway done and the doorbell rang. And I said, she did like this, look down the hall, and I said, who is it? She said, I don't know. I said, can you see? So she walked down the hall a few steps, and she turned around, she came back, she said, I don't know who that is. You better go to the door because I don't know who it is. I went and opened the front door, and her dad, my son, and his girlfriend, they had decorated the front porch, the yard, the fence, everything. They had balloons and streamers and banners and flowers and everything all over the front porch. That's and awesome. Then the cars started coming back, and we just had a birthday parade.
Good for you.
And I said, oh, these kids are something else. So I went out yesterday to take the trash out, and the guy lives next door. He said, Miss Roots. And I said, yeah. He said, somebody came by today. Say, I think his name was Scott. Well, he was a day late. I don't know what happened to him, but the party had been the day before. So he said, you know what? That was a great thing that your children did. I said, yeah, you know what? I just feel so blessed that my children love me enough to do that. He said, you know, it almost brought tears to my eyes. He said, as a matter of fact, it did. So that's why I tell you, I feel like I'm just so blessed, and I just feel rich, even though I ain't got no money. I still feel like I'm the richest person in the world.
I appreciate you sharing that story, because that definitely speaks to wealth that I think people don't give credit to. It's family, love, experiences, receiving your flowers when you're here.
Yeah.
That's a huge thing. Mikhail, were you about to say something?
Yes, I was going to say something. Grandma, you might not even remember this, but it was probably about, I think I was still living in Richmond, so probably at least 10 years ago. And something had happened on the news, and we were all talking. And I asked my grandma what she thought about it, because we're both night owls. We like to stay up late and talk. And you looked at me and you said, I feel sorry for y'all, because back in my day, we knew who was with us and who was against us, but y'all don't have a clue. You know, because so much stuff was done behind closed doors, and policies and systems and all this stuff. But with everything that's happened in the last, couple months between the pandemic and George Floyd and Breonna and Ahmaud, I think it's really making it harder for some people to hide behind some of those things that they had done before. And, I look through my emails and I see all these emails from companies, where they feel like they have to speak out and we're for this, we're not for this. And CEOs are, their emails are being exposed.
Right.
So, I never forgot that comment, but when I think about where we are now, some of that stuff is just coming to the forefront. So just listening to y'all, I'm hopeful that it'll, get better, or people can learn how to hide it better. But either way, I'm choosing to be hopeful.
And we have to be as hopeful as possible. So Steve, go ahead and wrap us up with your thoughts. And I'm going to turn my light on, so I'm just getting up to do that. Go ahead.
Sure. So I Mrs. Roots mentioned that she went to the Red Lobster. The last time I went to Red Lobster, the server came over and said, "Sir, do you know what you want?" And I said, "Well, do you have frog's legs?" And she said, "Oh yeah." And I said, "Good. Hop into the kitchen and get me some shrimp." Anyway, Matt, I just want to wrap it up, again by thanking you so much for this opportunity to participate this evening. I want to thank you for putting this forum in place, and hopefully it'll go on for a very long time. And if you don't bring it to the TV stations or the radio stations, I will. But I really appreciate what you've done. A great deal of respect for you and everything you've done. And, I value you as a dear friend. So thank you so much for allowing me to participate. Mrs. Roots, I love your story. I love you. And it was a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. I feel the same way.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. This was an amazing civil conversations. Generations. I was born before.
Here he goes again.
Oh. And we're thankful. And thank you guys very much. I want to take one 30 seconds out just to say, we are. I want to.
It's all right. It's okay.
I just want to dedicate this episode to Aunt Cent. She passed away this week, and she's loved. And give your flowers to those you love while they're living. Cent gave a lot of flowers to us, and I'm thankful. And the Lyons family, the Wright family, the Bunns, the Pittmans, my family, the Aguitos, we're going to miss you, Aunt Cent. And thank you. Peace out, everybody. All right, that's the end of the stream.
All right, good deal. Excellent.
All right.